I am pleased to introduce our next speaker. James Thindwa is the outgoing Executive Director of Chicago Jobs with Justice. Jobs with Justice is a coalition of labor, community, faith, and student organizations that advocates for workers' rights and livable communities. Prior to joining JWJ, Thindwa served for 9 years as lead organizer for Metro Seniors in Action, a coalition that advocates for national health care, mass transit, rights for managed care patients, and maintaining Social Security and Medicare as public programs. Between 1985 and 1992, Mr. Thindwa served as staff director for the Citizens Action Coalition of Indiana and Ohio Citizen Action. He serves on the boards of the Illinois Labor History Society, Northwestern University's Children and Family Justice Center, and In These Times magazine, for which he occasionally writes. Thindwa was a leader in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1970s and 1980s, and remains active in anti-war, human rights, environmental, and global justice struggles. His work as an organizer was the subject of PBS's Bill Moyer's Journal on March 27th. He has a BA and an MA in political science from Berea College and Miami University in Ohio, respectively. Please join me in welcoming James Thindwa.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon to you all. How's the conference going? Yeah, everybody learning a lot and exchanging good ideas. I caught the tail end of the last lecture. I was wishing I'd been around at the beginning. Chicago Jobs with Justice is a coalition of labor and community, religious, and student organizations, with some policy groups that are part of that organization, whose mission is to lend support to workers who want to form unions. We strongly believe that a healthy democracy is simply not possible without a robust labor movement. And this is borne out by history. The facts on the ground are quite compelling. The best functioning democracies in the world today, in the West, North America, Japan, also have labor movements that have played a significant role, that continue to play a significant role, although in the United States, labor has been in decline for quite some time. That they played a big role in developing strong middle classes and educating workers, and really being champions of social justice. Labor unions are a force that has so many implications for society. We know that when workers belong to unions, they're much more civically engaged. Data show that workers who belong to unions vote in larger numbers. They contribute more to local institutions in their communities. They're just much more active. And so from a personal note, I grew up in Southern Africa, in the country of Zimbabwe, and so I came here with a slightly different, a slightly more mature view of labor than my counterparts when I was a freshman at Berea College, where I heard just an enormous amount of negative talk about union, most of it anecdote-driven, that focused on corruption of individuals, whether it was Jimmy Hoffa or Jackie Presser, the Teamsters, and there was sort of this focus on the flaws within the labor movement, as if institutions in society are expected to be perfect. And certainly when you compare with what's happening on the corporate side, and especially of late, there's a lot of corruption and malfeasance to go around. So I've never really understood why there was a single-minded focus on corruption when one talked about labor unions. In Southern Africa, unions were very much involved in the anti-colonial struggles in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Malawi, in Botswana, and I heard labor leaders speak about issues beyond the bargaining table. Labor leaders spoke about oppression, that they were involved in anti-racist struggles, they were involved in women's rights movement. And so I grew up sort of having a vision of labor as a broad institution, a force, a movement that carried a broad range of agendas, from civil rights to labor rights to anti-racism and so forth. And so I decided quite earlier on that if I didn't end up teaching at a university, which I didn't do, I dropped out of grad school. After I left Miami University, I went to Ohio State University to try to work in a doctoral program, and decided I really wanted to be an activist on a full-time basis. And one thing that I really was interested in doing is finding some way to work directly with unions, or work that allowed me to intersect with labor unions. So in many ways, Jobs with Justice was a perfect place for me, because what it does, it brings community organizations together to work with unions to empower workers and to make sure that they have a voice at work. There's no question, there's very little debate now that we have witnessed runaway corporate power, that there's a disproportionate power concentrated in the hands of CEOs, and it's quite evident what that has led us to. There's no, I think, any analysis of the current collapse in the economy of the economy cannot exclude the degree to which the collective voice of workers has been ignored, not included in corporate institutions, and of course the declining numbers of union members in the United States is quite troubling. In the early 1970s, 1973, 33% of the labor force was unionized. That number is now down to about 8.5%. No, 33% in 1973, 8.5% currently. It's about 10% if you include public sector workers. So this has a lot of implications for democracy and for public policy, because if you go back and you look at when labor was strong, what was accomplished, what did labor contribute to this society? A lot of things that we take for granted, the 5-day week, overtime pay, weekends and vacations, and healthcare benefits, you name it. Good salaries when workers belong to unions. And in terms of public policy, labor has. You look at the Family Leave Act back in 1992. The minimum wage was going up quite steadily for a while, and then in 1997 it hit a roadblock. And for the next 10 years, from 1997 to 2007, the minimum wage stayed at about $5.15, and that can also be traced to the declining power of labor unions, the inability of unions to exert their presence in the public policy arena and force a continued increase in the minimum wage. And so, and we're also seeing an enormous amount of social stability in communities that were relatively stable. And I'm not someone who wears rose glasses and looking back to history. Many of these communities, on the south side of Chicago and west side of Chicago, for example, have had problems for a while, but there's no question that those problems have been exacerbated by disappearing work or declining wages that are in part attributable to declining unionization rates. So what we've tried to do in Jobs with Justice is to say that the decline in the numbers of workers who are unionized need not result in less power for unions. That what we need to do is to convince community organizations, convince religious groups, convince other forces within the community that they have a stake in what happens to workers. Some of this is kind of, it's a given, something that we should automatically assume, but it bears repeating that when workers stop bringing money to these communities, those local institutions suffer. They die. There's no way. You look at some of the churches on the west side, the south side of Chicago, and other institutions that historically have provided good services. I've spoken to ministers who had big churches who used to provide shelters for homeless people, after-school programs for kids, shelters for battered women, soup kitchens on weekends, and they can't do that anymore because their members, many of them who used to work in the industrial sector, workers who worked at in Gary, the steel mills, and making $25, $30 an hour, are now working at Home Depot for $7 or $8 an hour. And so that translates into fewer dollars being collected on Sunday and less services being provided to the community. So part of what I've been doing over the years at Jobs with Justice is really approaching community organizations and saying the reason you should come to the Congress Hotel to join that picket line down there isn't just a question of social justice for those workers. Your communities are affected enormously when workers are marginalized at work and when they can't bring in resources into those neighborhoods. Local grocery stores, local hardware stores, when workers can't get in there on weekends and buy stuff, fix their homes and so forth, those stores will not do very well. So, on a macro level, it's also it's impossible to analyze the current economic crisis outside of this general context in which workers are making less and less money. American workers are increasingly unable to buy products that they make. You can't run an economy like that. That's simply not sustainable. We've heard the analysis around sort of the banking crisis and what the bankers have done to the economy. We've heard about the home mortgage lending crisis, but we have not heard enough about the role of a low-wage economy in the collapse of this of our economic system currently. So I say this to really elevate unionization as a very, very important concept and a very important phenomenon in building democracies and building good, robust economies and building good, strong neighborhoods. So why have unions declined? There are many explanations, obviously, and part of it, obviously, is that globalization has put enormous amount of pressures on corporations who are now competing with other global corporations who work in societies that don't have very strong laws. They don't have strong labor laws, for example. In some countries, you simply don't have a right to organize. Very weak human rights standards. They have weak environmental laws, and so those countries both serve as a destination for those corporations who want to go out and exploit cheap labor and not be burdened by regulations, and also that products that are made in those countries inherently become cheaper and undermine corporations here. So it's a kind of there's a strong relationship there. But there's no question that the decline of unions is also a function of intentional strategies, elaborate strategies by corporations to undermine labor unions. How has this taken place? It's taken place in many different ways. Corporations have increased their role in the political system in my view, you talked about lobbyists early on. In my view, and I think this is a widely shared view, in very unhealthy ways. Corporations are making enormous amount of contributions. Essentially, I don't think there's a nicer way to put this. They're bribing politicians to get their dirty work done in centers of power, the city council, state legislatures, and in Washington. And so if you're getting corporate money, notwithstanding the disclaimers by politicians, I'm independent, I'm getting all this money, even though I'm getting all this money from Walmart and all these companies, when they go to Washington, it's either explicit or it's implied that what they are doing by taking that money is essentially promising to go to Washington to undermine, labor laws. There's no question that labor laws have been weakened in the United States. Right now, a corporation can fire workers. One out of five workers in the United States who tries to organize a union is fired. In 1 out of 4 cases, corporations threaten to shut down a plant and move overseas as a way to avoid unionization. And a lot of the stuff that they're doing is actually illegal, but what has happened is that in Washington, Congress has weakened enforcement mechanisms so that the penalty for doing so has become so negligible that for most companies it's simply another cost of doing business. There is no deterrence anymore. And they've gotten to Washington and forced Congress back in 1994, as you know, to pass the North American Free Trade Agreement, and more recently, in 2005, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And some of you might remember the debate around these trade deals. The reason NAFTA passed with almost no conditionalities around workers' rights and environmental standards and human rights standards is that corporations prevailed. They not only were present in terms of their lobbying power, but politicians who had received funding. There was a direct correlation between how much money politicians received from companies and how they voted on the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, what NAFTA does, quite simply, is it removes the tariffs between Mexico and the United States and Canada. That's a tax that, historically, for especially developing countries that want to protect their economies, they've used that to sort of manage their and nurture the local industries. And so, when you remove that, you make it easy for companies for goods and services to move between borders. What has happened in Mexico as a result of NAFTA is that we have seen an increase in migration from Mexico. That's one of the consequences of that trade agreement. I'm going to come back to that later on, but I'm simply trying to demonstrate that corporate power has produced for corporations some real bonanzas out there, so that labor unions are in a position now, a very weak position, because the laws have simply the laws have been weakened, and on the enforcement side, they've gone ahead and defunded a lot of the agencies that enforce laws, and so you really don't even have inspectors to come around anymore. If you look at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Mine Safety and Health Administration, those agencies that enforce workplace safety standards, there's an atmosphere of impunity. Corporations are operating right now in a cycle of impunity that is so at odds with how things should be in a democracy like this, in part because I was talking to a union organizer from the South who was at that, I don't know if you heard back in I forgot what year that was. It was in late 80s, a chicken plant in South Carolina caught fire, and about 25 workers were killed. And as it turned out, the owner of the plant had padlocked the back against the law. You simply have to have easy exits in those plants. But a chicken caught fire, and the whole thing kind of escalated, and the place burned down, and workers couldn't get out because the employer said that people were stealing chickens, and he needed to padlock the factory. But the upshot of the story is that you could, since 1985, you could count on only one inspector coming to inspect a plant once every 50 years for safety violations. So the word is out to corporations that, look, you can operate with almost total impunity. You cannot expect inspectors to come in and inspect and enforce the law. So that is the kind of the general atmosphere, and so we think that this has really contributed to undermining labor and sort of allowing there's a sort of this heavy bias that we're seeing in our economy in favor of maximum profits that are being done oftentimes at the expense of workers. And at the expense of our communities. Here in Chicago, we've really become a microcosm of some of these struggles. Some of you remember the Walmart debate back in 2006 when Walmart wanted to come to Chicago, and we, Jobs with Justice and several organizations said, you can come to Chicago, but we want you to pay a living wage to the workers. Walmart, as some of you know, is the it's the world's largest corporation. Here in the United States, they have 1.3 million workers. It is also perhaps the most aggressively anti-union corporation. None of the workers in the United States who work for Walmart are allowed to join a union. The company has a network of consultants and lawyers who come into town and pressure workers and use all kinds of intimidations and to prevent workers from organizing. So none of the 1.3 million workers who work for Walmart are unionized, and that's what sort of going back to the political the political issue I was raising, that Walmart is also one of the most active companies in terms of how they fund elected officials and participate in members of business associations such as the Chamber of Commerce that make it possible in Washington for labor law to be weakened and to create the kind of impunity that I just talked about. But so what we said in Chicago was that as a condition of coming into town, you need to pay workers a living wage of $10 an hour and an additional $3 per hour that would cover health insurance. The reason for that is quite simple. It's a wealthy corporation. Walmart makes about $350 billion in sales per year and makes about $11.5 billion in profits. It pays H. Lee Scott, the CEO, $35 million per year before stocks. And Mr. H. Lee Scott makes about $16,000 per hour. And his workers, if you get your calculator out, at $7.30 is making almost exactly $16,000 per year. And yet H. Lee Scott was in town with his army of lobbyists and lawyers in 2006 to convince the city council to oppose the living wage ordinance. Well, we went ahead and really did a lot of public education and explained to people that the right to organize is fundamental. It's a key tenet of democracy. A corporation like Walmart that is, by the way, receiving $1.5 billion in tax subsidies from the public in the United States should be expected to pay a living wage. The company can't simply have it both ways. You cannot, on the one hand, say to workers, we can't let you join a union, but you can't go to the legislature either to ask the legislature to pass a law to force us to pay a living wage. They argued in the city council that getting a living wage passed was essentially interfering with the marketplace. This would have a distorting effect on free enterprise. We just don't do that in America. We don't regulate. We don't artificially raise wages, notwithstanding, of course, that we have a minimum wage nationally. So the question for us was, how do we convince people that this was the right thing to do? Remember that a lot of these neighborhoods in Chicago are so vulnerable. On the west side, Walmart announced that they were coming into Chicago in 2003. That's the same year that Brock's Candy closed on the west side. And so it really, their arrival into Chicago coincided with a lot of factory closures. Ryerson Steel Mill on 83rd and Stewart had just closed down on the south side also. And so you have a vulnerability. On the political side, politicians are in a hurry to replace those jobs that they just lost. And they're vulnerable to, hey, listen, we're coming here, we want to give you jobs. We don't have the luxury to debate a living wage. The living wage gets in the way. And so they really managed to portray any effort to force a living wage on Walmart as obstructionist, that this was not really about the living wages, the unions who just want to organize workers and collect union dues. And so they really argued, presented a false choice to Chicagoans, that the choice was really about a low-wage Walmart job or no job at all. And, of course, a lot of the workers who are losing their jobs, 1,500 workers had just been laid off, had lost their jobs at Brock's. So, and you are vulnerable in that moment. But we decided to really set an example here in Chicago that corporations cannot be allowed to come into these neighborhoods and exploit workers, and make billions of dollars without being accountable. And one of the things that was also important for us to mention was that Walmart has itself set its business model is implicated in many of the problems that we're seeing right now. Walmart's business model, predicated on low prices, has contributed to the decision of many companies, many manufacturers, in fact, to shut down and move overseas. Because what happens is that Walmart now is so huge that they have a disproportionate share of the marketplace. For many manufacturers who make products for Walmart, you'll find they've got 1/3, sometimes 50% of their contracts with this one company. They're supplying a lot of stuff to Walmart. And so the bargaining table in terms of negotiating a contract disproportionately favors Walmart's representatives. They sit at the table and say, that bicycle, last year we paid $20 wholesale for that. This year, we want you to reduce that to $15. Otherwise, we'll go to that supplier over there. And so the factory owner is under pressure to figure out a way to continue to be profitable and reduce the price of that bicycle to $15. So what do? They go back to the workers and say, that pay hike you negotiated last year, not so fast. We have to renegotiate that because now we've got to reduce the price of the bicycle. Failing that, they have to oftentimes shut down and move overseas. Brax Candy closed on the west side and moved to Mexico. And Argentina, they split into two. So, in fact, the decision of many suppliers to shut down and move is actually connected to the pressure that is being exerted by huge retailers like Walmart. So, it's a business model that is really at the center. It's at the center of the decision of so many companies to actually shut down and move. So, for us, it was really a question of accountability. Should a company that is implicated in job flight in the first place be allowed to come back into Chicago and say they are now the solution to joblessness in Chicago and that they want to get away with paying a low wage to workers, sort of business as usual? And what happened to the right of workers to organize, a fundamental right, you could argue constitutionally, the right to associate, the right of free speech, right to assemble? But also, looking at the fact that this traditionally has been a very reliable way for workers to earn a good wage. Another thing that people really understood was that the reason we wanted to force this corporation to pay a living wage and to pay health care benefits is that across the country, the reason Walmart is able to sell these products at such a cheap price is that they skimp on health care. It's a revolving door at Walmart. Walmart workers don't stay very long because if you stay too long, you start qualifying for health insurance. So they keep them just barely, you get close enough to being full-time, 25 hours, 30 hours. You don't really get to be a full-time worker and so on, therefore not qualify for health insurance. But what we found was that in places like Georgia, for example, 10,000 kids in Georgia were found to be on the SCHIP program, the state Children's Health Insurance Program, 10,000 kids whose parents worked for Walmart. We found in Chicago Walmart workers on Section 8 housing. We found Walmart workers receiving LAHIP support, low-income home energy assistance program. Your tax money is subsidizing workers who work for the wealthiest corporation on earth. And so we really created a broad rationale why this company needed to be held accountable to a living wage. To make a long story short, we convinced the City Council to pass this ordinance. It passed in July of 2006 by a whopping 35 votes to 14 votes. Unfortunately, your mayor, Mayor Daley, stepped in and defended his corporate friends and vetoed that ordinance. The living wage would have put $10 per hour in the hands of 10,000 workers in Chicago. I would like for you to think for a moment what we are talking about right now in Chicago. We're talking about deficits, right? We're talking about budget deficits. We are selling parking meters. We're selling Midway Airport. We're selling public assets because the mayor said we have no money. And yet when the opportunity was available to him in 2006 to allow 10,000 workers to be active economically, if we had increased the pay, the workers who work for Walmart and Target and Home Depot and Menards, making a good $10 per hour, would go back into those neighborhoods, contribute to local institutions, buy stuff at the hardware store, at the barber shop. The city collects a tax and actually helps its revenue. So this is the neoliberal policies that Mayor Daley has pursued are clearly implicated in the financial troubles that we're seeing today. This bias in favor of maximum profits for large corporations at the expense of workers, at the expense of neighborhoods. Development patterns in Chicago, that's a different story, certainly have been favoring downtown at the expense of neighborhoods. And so the struggles that we've waged in Chicago are not unlike what's going on across the world. That in fact what we're seeing here today, the pressures on workers to accept less pay, the withdrawal of government. If you notice, government services being cut back. This has been the model, the economic model of the past 30 years. Public spending being being cut back, privatization of public assets. This is being played out. It's being played out across the world, and the connection is very real because what we find is that a lot of the companies, as I talked about, if you want to really understand the real connection between what we're seeing here in Chicago and what we're seeing across the world, is that when corporations make the decision to leave the United States, under pressure, obviously, to come up with cheap products by the likes of Walmart, they are moving to another country. Let's pick a place. Let's pick Dhaka, Bangladesh. A factory owner from the United States arrives in Bangladesh and says to the local elites, who, mind you, just like the Chicago politicians were under pressure to bring jobs because they just lost a factory on the south side and a factory on the west side and were vulnerable to, the sweet talk from Walmart about, take this, low-wage job. The political elites in Bangladesh are under, just as much, if not more, pressure to accept any deal to get that factory to relocate in Dhaka. So the conversation goes something like this. The factory owner says, well, here we want to build this blue jeans factory in your town. But you got to help us. You have to sort of help us, sort of create a business-friendly climate. In our world, that's code for you need to think about preventing those union organizers from coming to this plant and trying to organize the workers. You need to do something about those child welfare advocates who are going to be poking around this factory to see if children or underage kids are being used in this factory. You've got to do something about the environmentalists who are going to come around to see what's being discharged into the local air, into the local water. And of course, there's human rights activists who are always fussing about human rights and so forth. You gotta keep them at bay. The women's rights advocates are going to be concerned about how women are being treated. So you get the drift. And so what you're seeing there is the steady erosion of the building blocks for democracy itself, right? You can't have democracy without labor unions. You can't have democracy without women's rights advocates. You can't have democracy without environmental advocates. You can't have democracy without child welfare advocates. You can't have democracy without civil society. That's what that is. And so the terms of entry into this country, the terms of entry for these corporations, the terms of entry for these factories into these countries is now implicated in the dismantling of the democracy project itself in these countries with very dangerous implications. But it also has enormous implications for, let's say, immigration. When we talk about immigration in the United States, something that I told Jamie I was going to spend just a little bit of time talking about because it's important. It's important for me as an immigrant personally, but also to have the kind of healthy, robust, fair, and complicated debate that it is. Immigration is not the easy debate, because what has happened in the United States right now is that that debate has, in our view, illegitimately and single-handedly focused on the people who cross the borders, as if there's nothing else that happens out there. It is not focused on the forces and structures that are creating these dislocations in other countries, and they need to be interrogated. People behind those decisions, policymakers who are making these decisions, need to be held to account and be interrogated. So what happens when these factories relocate to those countries is that the workers start feeling. They start getting marginalized, right? They've entered that factory. They can't join a union, right? You would think that someone who is opposed to immigration in the United States would actually be supporting trade legislation that says that as a condition of signing on to a trade deal with the United States, you need to allow your workers to join a union. Because if workers in Mexico and workers in Bangladesh at that blue jeans factory could join a union and actually increase their wages and benefits and improve their lives, it actually creates a disincentive to migrate. Why would you want to move? Migration is quite simply an economic decision. Workers, not unlike corporations, they get up in the morning and they decide, I need to go someplace else to increase my earnings. What's interesting is that we've accepted the premise that corporations can traverse the globe in search of profits, in search of profit maximization, and that's a perfectly rational decision. But there's somehow something subversive and unseemly and offensive about a worker who decides to leave Mexico and come to the United States to do the same thing, to find a way to increase his or her earning potential. And so this particular brand of globalization, this business model that is devoid of standards, because what really at the end of the day this is about is that companies are taking advantage of trade agreements that do not explicitly protect the right of workers to organize, trade deals that do not explicitly protect basic environmental standards, trade agreements that do not protect human rights standards. That's what the debate about NAFTA was about. Labor unions and their allies in the environmental community, in the human rights community, were saying, let's not pass NAFTA without those key protections so that we don't create a race to the bottom in which the countries that are compromising their standards, compromising human rights standards, compromising labor standards, compromising environmental standards become the destination for corporations who want to exploit the vulnerability of these countries. And so that's really part of what we need to engage in, but what we're engaging in a lot of organizations, social organizations here in the United States and across the world are now zeroing in on this question of how do we fashion trade? How do we create? And we're not anti-trade. I think the other side has been very shrewd in framing this debate as those who are for trade and those who are against trade. And so when you question NAFTA, when you question CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, you're caricatured as protectionist and anti-trade, when in fact what we're arguing is that it is possible to have trade. We've always, for hundreds of years, had international trade. It's possible to have it, but it needs to be humanized. It needs to cater to the interests of workers. It needs to cater to the interests of communities. It needs to respect human values. It needs to respect, uphold basic environmental standards. And so that's what we need to do. And so just sort of proceeding on this question of immigration, so as globalization itself is implicated in mass migration, it's also important to look at how the role that corporations are playing in other things that are affecting migration, right? I just talked about how trade agreements are doing that. But there's another thing that we often don't think about. I was talking to my friends at the table here before I got up here, that we always talk about sort of the environment as a kind of separate entity, and environmentalists as a kind of public interest group. The whole discourse around global warming needs to shift away from just being an environmental issue as being a kind of social justice, to put it in a social justice economic frame, because that's what it is, so that it includes everyone. It impacts all of us. But just as a point of fact, in 2005, 20 million people across the world were classified as climate refugees. These are people who are now leaving their countries, their homes, because of violent weather patterns, radical shifts in weather. In 2010, 50 million, did I say 20,000 or 20 million? 20 million in 2005. In 2010, 50 million people across the world will be classified as climate refugees. By 2050, 150 million people are going to be classified across the world as climate refugees. And so there's going to be migrations. I mean, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in 2006 said that at any given time, 197 million people across the world are in a state of migration. So this is a global phenomenon. But the debate cannot just focus on those individuals who are moving, which is what has been wrong with the debate in the United States. Notice who is opposing climate change legislation in the United States. Notice the same people who are robustly and angrily anti-immigrant, who find themselves denying that human beings have anything to do with global warming. The global warming deniers are also at the forefront of the anti-immigration movement, oblivious to the fact that U.S. policies, the United States is 5% of the world's population, and yet it's producing 25% of the greenhouse gases that are implicated in global warming. So the policymakers in Washington cannot wash their hands off and just say, so this is really about just people entering the United States, illegals. The illegals, they can't just say that. Their inability to deal with global warming ought to be interrogated, ought to be ought to be examined, and it's accountability. The other factor is that maybe a little bit off topic, but I think it's connected, is that the role corporations have played in some of the wars that the United States is involved in. I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think you need to be a conspiracy theorist to understand that business interests are very much a part of the reason the United States is in Iraq. And so wars themselves, which, if we solved our energy problems in the United States, the energy crisis, if we start conserving energy and using alternative fuels, I doubt very much that there would be too much eagerness to go to war in places like Iraq. But wars are implicated in mass migrations in ways that we very seldom talk about in this country, right? 2.5 million Iraqis are now displaced internally because of the Iraq war. 2.5 million are refugees outside of Iraq. And they're going to end up some place, some country, the United States. The U.S. is going to increase its intake of Iraqi refugees. So what is the debate going to look like? Should it leave out the person in 2003 who voted to go to war in Iraq? When you find Vietnamese people here, 900,000 Vietnamese were dislocated because of the Vietnam War. When you find them here, when you find people from Nicaragua, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Chile, chances are their presence here is connected to a decision somebody made to either go to war in those countries or sponsor one of the parties to these disputes in those countries. There's no question that the United States, and I don't want to sit here and bash the U.S. necessarily, because there's a lot of good that this country does, but there's no question that the U.S. has been on the wrong side of the human rights debate in these countries for decades. And that human rights abuses are one of the key reasons people decide to leave their countries and go someplace else. There's a lot of flight that takes place because of human rights conditions in those countries. And so I say this to say that the discourse around immigration needs to be a bit more sophisticated than it has been. It needs to examine not just the people who cross the borders, but what it is that is causing them to make decisions, a decision so profound to leave their homes and come to the United States. Let's look at the trade agreements that are creating problems in Mexico. 3 million to 6 million Mexicans, according to the Economic Policy Institute and the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. Both of those put the numbers between 3 million and 6 million Mexicans who have been displaced because of NAFTA. Why? Because grain that is produced in the United States, Corn Belt in Iowa and Nebraska and Ohio and Indiana, is now sold in Mexico at much cheaper rates. You buy corn in Mexico now at a cheaper rate than locally produced corn. And so the farmers in Mexico simply can't compete. They can't compete with Archer Daniels, Midland, and Monsanto, and Dole. And so what are they doing? They're essentially selling off their farms and trekking to Mexico City, and eventually ending up trekking north to the United States to get work. And our politicians in Washington who voted for NAFTA show up at the border and say, let's build a wall and keep these people out, and call them felons. So there needs to be accountability. There needs to be accountability about wars, as I just said. People to think hard about what wars do, the sort of regional instability that are caused by wars, and a whole host of factors. And so what Jobs with Justice with many other organizations has attempted to do is to sort of bring complexity to some of these debates, to say that it really, it matters for citizens to get involved. It matters for unions to grow and for workers to join unions, because they really become an important voice in nourishing this democracy. When workers are not doing well, when workers have to work 2-3 jobs, which are some of the consequences of the low-wage economy, has been the kind of the de facto disenfranchisement of people. The Chicago Tribune ran a series not too long ago of sort of the low-wage workers, women, single mothers who are working 2-3 jobs at minimum wage, who are traveling long distance. 60% of the new jobs being created, by the way, are being created in the suburbs. So there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time traveling to those jobs at very low wages. And it's very difficult to get poor people, get those folks to come to the city council, to rally and to lobby and to talk to their elected officials and to testify on their own behalf as to why a living wage is important. It's very difficult to get them to show up in Washington, the Congress or the state legislature, to be active participants in sort of creating their own destiny. So the low-wage business model has cost us quite a bit in terms of the whole question of civic participation, not just as a matter of the economic, sort of the social justice question. It really is the case that people right now are facing so much pressure that political participation becomes a luxury and sort of the exclusive province of middle-class people. And so we need to be invested in building this. Congress right now is considering passage of the Employee Free Choice Act, which is a law that makes it easier. How am I doing on time, by the way? 10 minutes. The Employee Free Choice Act is a law that is going to start correcting some of these abuses of the past several decades. It's going to make it easier for workers to join unions. It says that with a simple card check, if 51% of workers at a workplace sign a card saying they want to join a union, that should automatically certify the union. The way things work right now, when workers sign a card, the employer steps in and there has the National Labor Relations Board schedules an election, the so-called secret ballot. And there's a huge span of time between when workers make that declaration and when the first election takes place, that it allows for an enormous amount of time for the employers to interfere with workers. The intimidations that I just talked to early on aren't just the figment of workers' imagination. Every worker will tell you who's trying to join a union the amount of pressure that they face, one-on-one meetings with employers, captive audience meetings. 60% of, it's actually 80% of employers hold captive audience meetings when a union drive has begun at the workplace. That means you get locked into a room and you're shown these vile videos of labor unions and sort of videos that literally suggest that it's a subversive idea in the United States to join a union. And so I've seen it. I've seen some of those videos. They're just outright offensive. And the good news is that workers, the vast majorities of workers have told pollsters that they will join a union tomorrow if they were able to. They're not able to because the employers prevail. The employers put pressure on them, and so they don't. The second thing that the Employee Free Choice Act does is to triple the penalties. I talked early on about one of the things that has facilitated the decline in unionization is this loosening of labor standards, labor law, and the very low penalties that the employers have to pay right now. The Employee Free Choice Act, EFCA, will fix that by tripling penalties for employers who violate the law. So we want to create a disincentive. We want to make sure that if you fire somebody who's trying to join a union, that the penalty will be high enough to make you think twice about it. The third thing that EFCA does is to impose arbitrary, mandatory arbitration. Because what happens typically is that even if you have an election and then you begin contract talks, employers can delay those contract talks. They can just engage in all kinds of stays and delays that workers lose interest, or they move on, they get fired, or for whatever reason. It's a process that allows employers to just play for time. And I've been to those schools, and the difference is palpable between a school in the south side of Chicago and a school in Schaumburg. The levels of investment. Jonathan Kozol has a book out showing how in Highland Park per capita spending for students is $14,000. In Chicago, it's $8,000. No one can argue that those things don't matter. But since funding is a function of sort of this formula around mortgage, it's based on tax, property taxes. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm getting tired. So if people are making, so the argument then has to be that we need to make sure that people are making additional, right? People are making decent incomes, right? Because that translates into by nice homes, and they pay into their education and so forth. So we can't really, the question of income is clearly at the center of this debate, and that what's happening in these neighborhoods is directly related to what we're doing to the economy. And so we have to bring an end to the era, and I think some of that is coming to an end right now. I think with the election last year, both in terms of the Congress and the presidential election, I think that there's a mood in this country right now of citizens wanting to be engaged and wanting to hold public officials accountable and saying no and really sort of bring an end to the cycle of impunity within which corporate America has functioned. We can't have a system where bankers get $16 billion in bonuses last year on Wall Street, 16 with a B, $billion in bonuses, while they're driving the system straight into the ground. Citizens of a democracy cannot allow that level of impunity. So my hope is that in your teachings and in your sort of personal life, that these are issues that you keep in mind and you continue to educate and get your students involved in a great civic project. Thank you very much.